All right. Good evening. We're only 9 minutes late, so good to see you. Well, I can't see you, but you see me. Get settled in. We have a lot of stuff to get through today. This is Chapter 2, Domain 1 that we're going to cover. It's April 15th. Let's get going. So, my apologies for the technical difficulties. Um, just the way it goes. All right. So if you haven't done so already, we did set up an online study group. I see that we already had like almost 200 people signed up, so that's cool. And I see that there's some chatter already starting there. Use that group however you want. Myself, Brad, Ryan, Brandon, we have numerous people there moderating and answering questions. But for the most part, it's your study group. Use it how you want. Just be respectful. It's there to help you pass the exam, answer whatever questions you want. It's cool to see that people are using that already. This is what it looks like. I'm just going to go through quickly how to get into the study group in case you don't know, in case this is news to you. This is the URL here. When you get there, you'll see this screen down the bottom right or left. You'll see apply for membership. Go ahead and click that button. Then this will pop up. Enter in your email address, click confirm email address, and that's it. Now the group is you have to be approved to get into the group. So once you've done that, we get an email and then we just approve it. It's pretty quick for the most part. You may have to wait sometimes depending on the hours of the day for us to see it and go ahead and approve it. Just right, when I took this screenshot this afternoon, there were 174 members. It's like 200 something now, so that's very cool. This is one of the polls that one of you put up already. I thought that this was kind of neat. Use it for this stuff too. And I see that right now there's a whole bunch of people who are registering, so that's great. This was a cool poll, I think, and it'll be neat to see how it kind of works out. We can use this for all kinds of stuff like that. So 31.1% of you so far, less than 5 years experience. So welcome. Some people call you newbies, but we're not going to do that. We're going to just say welcome. 6 to 10 years, 35. That's the biggest demographic so far. And then you got the old people. Well, maybe old, over 20 years. That's where I fit. So something cool to share with you. We put together some information about just the mentor program. This year is more popular than any other year. So we put this together. It's just kind of cool to see that the growth. Um, it's neat because there's no strings attached, so you kind of feel good about that. And this is you guys. So 1,444 people registered for this year. So it's really really neat. I guess when we started back, in 2010, I don't know what we really expected, but to see that, we're helping this many people. Hopefully, you guys will pay this forward as you progress in your own career. Maybe you are already doing this kind of stuff yourself. If you are, then good for you. It's we all need each other in this industry. We went through, on Monday, we talked about how we have such a talent shortage in our industry. If we all work together, that's kind of our hope for making this thing better. And I see a whole bunch more people are still signing up. Man, it's going crazy. All right, good. So this is what we're going to talk. Now we're getting into the content. So this is stuff where you got to get your memory hat on. If you got one of those, I don't even know what that looks like, but it's time to start sort of memorizing a whole bunch of stuff. Some of the stuff will be really basic. It's fundamentals, so that's good, I guess. So for some of you, you'll be like, yeah, I already got this stuff. That's great. It'll be a good refresher. For others, this will be all new. So yeah, you'll have to pay attention. So let's go. This is the agenda for this evening. We'll talk about cornerstone information security concepts, cornerstone fundamentals, those things, legal and regulatory issues. Some of the stuff in the book is a little bit dated. Now we're having buffering issues. Some of the stuff is just a little bit dated, but still relevant. I think things haven't changed monumentally, but like you'll see things like the EU privacy directive when that's really been replaced by GDPR. You won't see a lot about CCPA, which is California's new privacy law, but that's also relevant to a practitioner, but it may not be covered in your exam. So we'll cover all that stuff, legal and regulatory issues. If you've been around long enough, you might find yourself, working with legal counsel. That's not uncommon. I'll share some of my stories. People like that, I guess. We'll talk about ethics. So for security and third parties, we'll talk about third parties. I'm kind of surprised that actually in the exam and in the content that we don't cover third party risk a little bit deeper. According to some statistics, 65% of all breaches come directly or indirectly through third parties. So it's a big piece of a practitioner's life, but you'll just get it briefly in the exam. Talk about ethics. For people that are ethical, you don't usually have to talk too much about ethics, but the ethics that we really want to focus on for tonight and for the exam are the 4 canons that come from the ISC squared. You'll have to subscribe to those, but you'll also need to memorize those, and you'll need to memorize them in order. So that's going to be big for you. Information security governance, just the basics on that. Access control, defensive categories and types. Risk analysis for 500, please, Alex. And types of attackers. That's what we're going to talk about. It'll be fun. Trust me. All right. Now I got to get my slides, man. Technical issues tonight. So how about a dumb dad joke? You know that this is what we do. What concert costs just 45 cents? I'll give you a second. 50 Cent featuring Nickelback. Dope. All right, I know. It's dumb. Let's get to it. So terms and definitions that you need to memorize. Really important to memorize. So if you don't get it the first time, don't worry too much about it. I was talking to, in our daily insanity check-in, we had a new person join us today who's actually in the exam or in the mentor program too. And he felt really reassured by the fact that you'll have to read the book a couple times probably. Don't expect to get it, the first time, especially if this is new content for you. This person I was talking to this morning, he's got 20 years of IT experience, but when he read the book the first time, it didn't really sink in. That's cool, man. It's not going to come naturally, and don't expect to get it right away. So just kind of stick with it. You might have to go through it, multiple times. So CIA triad, for many of us, this is you've seen it many times. For others, this is sort of new. So the C is for confidentiality, the I is for integrity, and the A is for availability. It's just one of the things that we use all the time. The importance of the CIA triad is to focus on all 3 of these at once. That's kind of the trick, and to keep them in balance. So memorizing what C is confidentiality, and I is integrity, and A is availability will be really important for your exam. And then identity. We'll talk about in today's class, we'll talk about identity, we'll talk about authentication, authorization, and accounting, IAAA. Identity is important, and you'll see this come up over and over and over again. Repetition is good for memory, so it's not a bad thing. Subject is an active entity. Subjects operate on objects. Subjects can also operate on other subjects within a computer system, right? So think of entities within a computer system. You've also got entities that can be a subject at one point and then become an object at another, and vice versa. So these are not static roles. They change over time. But the important thing to remember for the exam, and the important thing to remember just in general, is that a subject is an active entity. You might get a question in an exam where they give you some scenario where user is this, and a file is this, an application is this, and you have to pick out what's a subject and what's an object in that scenario. It's really not that difficult, but it is if you didn't memorize it. So you'll see that over and over and over again. These terms are really fundamental. I think for some of us, for some people in security, it's sort of difficult to go back to the fundamentals to talk about them again, because you sort of take these things for granted sometimes. One of the reasons why I enjoy teaching this class, other than being able to help people, is it gets me back to the fundamentals. It reminds me of, oh yeah, that's right. So even though it's kind of a pain for some of us to go through the fundamentals, it's healthy. All right, so terms and definitions to memorize. More risk. We talked about that on Monday. Likelihood and impact is what risk is. The likelihood of something bad happening, the impact of it did. Those are derivatives of threats and vulnerabilities. So those are the functions. Threats, consider the source oftentimes with a threat. And vulnerabilities are just a weakness in the system. So when you do risk analysis, if something is fully implemented, so you have a control that's completely 100% implemented, no deficiency in the control whatsoever, you could assume that there's no weakness then in that control. If that were the case, then it doesn't matter what the threats are. You could have almost infinite threats. If there's no weakness, there's no risk, right? So the same thing happens the other way. I can have a complete absence of a control, just no control whatsoever. But if there are no threats to that weakness, that vulnerability, again, there's no risk. So it's always this kind of back and forth. We don't put controls in place just for the sake of putting controls in place. We put controls in place to combat threats. A lot of times you'll see people buying things for their information security program. They don't have a risk there, so that'd be a waste of money. Annualized loss expectancy, or ALE. This will be a calculation that you'll need to learn, and we'll go through exactly what that calculation is. But annualized loss expectancy essentially takes an asset value, you multiply that by the exposure factor, and I'm just saying this stuff now so that when you get there, it won't be as much of a surprise. But asset value times exposure factor times annual rate of occurrence, sometimes they call it an ARO, that's what will give you annual loss expectancy. Now, annualized loss expectancy, the way it would work if people went through this exercise would be, if I've got an annualized loss expectancy of, say, $100,000, just for simple math, and the cost of a control is $50,000, and it only reduces my exposure factor by, say, 20%, so $70,000, $100,000 asset, you can now start to figure out what your total cost, not total cost of ownership, but your return on investment is. Now, usually we call that return on security investment, because what we're doing is we're not actually creating more value in the organization most often. We're saving the organization loss. So it's a return on security investment as opposed to your traditional return on investment. The book covers that maybe a little bit, but ROSI would be one that we would use more often than ROI for information security. Now, if you remember on Monday, I also mentioned that complexity is the enemy of information security. So keeping things simple is good for security. It makes it easier to secure. Now, sometimes we can translate simplicity to efficiency. In that case, I think you could make a pretty good case for return on investment, but it'd be difficult for you to quantify it. So, what's the actual dollars? That might be difficult. But in practice, you don't get too wrapped around the axle. It's very rare, actually, that we're, forced to or asked to calculate return on investment or return on security investment. And the big reason why is we just have really poor data in our industry. There's not really good loss data. The Ponemon research is probably one of the ones that's most cited. But the sample error rate, if you're a math person, the sample error rate for that study is huge, right? It's like 60, 70, maybe 100 organizations. And when you think about the population of organizations just in the United States, you're 6, 8, 10 million. And then if you talk about sole proprietors, it's 20 million. So that's the reason why we don't do this very often. Total cost of ownership is how much it costs for the control and maintenance of that control, including soft dollars, the people, maybe the FTEs that you have to devote to it. But these are all things that you'll need to memorize. If you just memorize what's on the slide, that's probably just fine. But being able to put it into context and put these pieces together, I think makes it a lot easier to memorize. We also went through this on Monday. I gave you sort of a sneak peek on the definition of information security. This is a definition that I've used for years and years. And I like the definition. There are other definitions. I mentioned also on Monday that there was kind of another one that I would accept. That's one that Ryan and I had worked on together. But this is the one that I use more often than any. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So there's our CIA triad. And that's really the focus of what I'm trying to protect, what characteristic of the information maybe I'm trying to protect or what perspective. And then administrative, physical, and technical controls are also very, very important. They all play together to create. And once you do this, long enough, it's almost like putting together pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. So it kind of becomes like a thing of beauty. And hope, I don't know if that's, maybe I'm just crazy, but when you get it all working together, you'll know it when you got it. So there's the CIA triad. Repetition is good. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's our CIA triad. The opposite of CIA is DAD, or disclosure, alteration, and destruction. So, the opposite of confidentiality is disclosure, unauthorized disclosure. And then integrity is alteration. Now we're going to get to two different types of integrity: data integrity and system integrity. It's alteration. Unauthorized alteration of either one of those is the A in DAD, and then destruction. Balance, absolutely, is critical. What we most often focus on is the confidentiality. We overemphasize confidentiality for a number of reasons. I think that's where most people are affected. That's where privacy lives. So we often overemphasize confidentiality or availability. Integrity is sort of one of those things that's nebulous, I think, for a lot of people, but also, very important. So first, confidentiality, or what we're trying to protect against, is unauthorized access, unauthorized disclosure, or read access. Now that becomes really important when we talk about security models, which are coming up in a few domains. Two models in particular, there's BIBA and Bell LaPadula. And I'm mentioning it now so that when we get there again, it won't be so much of a surprise. But Bell LaPadula is the one that protects against confidentiality. BIBA does integrity. And the way you'll memorize that is BIBA has an I in it, so I, integrity, just a little trick. We're trying to keep data secret. Data is accessible to subjects. And data in this case might be an object or it might be a subject. It depends on whether it's static or whether it's dynamic. But data accessible to subjects with clearance, formal approval, and need to know. We're going to cover all of those: clearance, formal approval, and need to know. But confidentiality, if you just remember confidentiality, unauthorized access, you're good. All right, and that is where privacy lives. So when you look at privacy, so what you start to understand is that privacy and information security can't be separated. Privacy is a subset of information security according to this definition. Now, the words that we use a lot in the industry, we use cybersecurity a lot. Cybersecurity is also a subset of information security because cyber, the word itself, is of or pertaining to computers. So that would fit within technical controls. It doesn't take into account at all administrative or physical controls. So, and that's a question you see all the time. You even see that from seasoned information security professionals. I saw one on LinkedIn, I think last week or the week before, where a very seasoned information security person asked that question. Is cybersecurity a subset of information security or vice versa? We just settled that. Cybersecurity is a subset of information security. Integrity. So two types of data integrity. What we're trying to do here with integrity is protect against unauthorized modification of something, right access. So going back to those models, BIBA would be here. Two types, data integrity and system integrity. And just to add a little extra, context, these are four types of data integrity: referential integrity, and entity integrity, domain integrity, and user-defined integrity. This comes into play a lot when you talk about database and database design and database structure. And then system integrity, really unauthorized modifications of systems. So data and systems, if the system is functioning the way it's intended, the way it was designed, then you can say that system integrity is intact. And the alternate would be true if you had unauthorized changes. All right, and then availability. ensure the data is available when it's needed. Confidentiality and integrity compete with availability. So you can really lock something down. You can see how this plays with each other. If I really lock something down, right, to try to prevent unauthorized disclosure, I can lock it down so much that availability suffers for it. We do this like when we put, sometimes, I've worked in some organizations where there were so many controls just on a VPN that it would take you 15, 20 minutes just to get the VPN up and running, get authenticated, get, through all the checks. You're stealing from availability when you do that. It's a trade-off. In some cases, trading off 15 minutes of availability or inconvenience is okay, but in other cases, it's not. Those two play right along with each other. All right, so risk. We've talked about this on Monday too. Just, again, repetition. Risk. You can focus on critical assets because it's assumed that, the impact. So we talked about likelihood and impact. The impact would be more significant if it was a critical asset. Most organizations haven't figured out what assets they have, let alone what critical assets they have. But if we focused on critical assets, then we would take that part of the equation, we would account for it anyway, the impact piece. Likelihoods then play on that. But that doesn't mean we don't focus on the other assets either, because some assets maybe by themselves aren't critical, but when you take them in aggregate, they become critical. So focusing on the critical assets as a place to start is a good idea, but don't neglect the other assets as well. We use safeguards or controls. If you've read HIPAA before, God help you. But HIPAA refers to controls as safeguards. So they talk about administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. Controls, they're interchangeable words. We use controls to protect. And again, if you've got a fully implemented control, there's no weakness, right? That's one part of the equation with risk. Risk tolerance is how much risk I'm going to accept. That's assuming, if you remember on Monday, there are two things that a CISO does in simplistic terms. One is consult the business on information security risk so that they can make good risk decisions. Those risk decisions end up being our risk tolerance. So the risks that they'll accept, mitigate, transfer, or avoid, those are the only four choices you get with risk. Risk ignorance is not a valid choice. But when you make those decisions, when you go through that decision-making process, that's what determines your risk tolerance. The business does that. So doing the risk assessment is one thing. Now we have to make decisions on what we're going to do with it. That determines our risk tolerance. So that's what risk tolerance is. It's what you're going to accept. Privacy is managing risks to confidentiality, using the same types of controls, administrative, physical, and technical controls, but really it's just focusing on confidentiality. So you can see in the definition that this is clearly part of information security. The sad thing is many organizations treat them as two separate disciplines that don't interoperate very well together. If you see that, that's an opportunity for you to fix something. They have to work closely together. And the reason why they became separate is because privacy was so legalistic. The laws really were written and focused on privacy, that what you had two different people working on it. Lawyers took up the privacy piece while in most cases IT took up the security piece. So then you had this kind of separation. In a lot of places, IT and legal, it's like oil and water. So that's kind of how we ended up where we are. It was also, HIPAA is a classic example. With HIPAA, the privacy rule, there's three rules, right? The privacy rule, the security rule, and the breach notification rule. The privacy rule was the one that in 1996, when HIPAA was originally ratified or approved, it wasn't until 2003 before it kind of all became finalized. It was the privacy rule that was, immediately adopted and enforced because of the legal consequences if we didn't. So that's about the same time that everybody had to start filling out all sorts of forms in hospitals and clinics. And security was really neglected. Security in healthcare really didn't get any traction until meaningful use came about. Meaningful use came about 2000, 10, 9, somewhere in there. And meaningful use, because then the government was actually paying you to implement electronic medical records. Whole story there. But anyway, the point here is privacy got out way in front of information security. And if you worked in healthcare, you know kind of the place where security still is today. Lots of reasons for that too. So this is just an article that I wrote for Forbes. Where I explain that these things really can't be separated. They shouldn't be separated. They need to be integrated, not just in concept but also in practice. The unified approach, when you combine these, it gives you so much opportunity to simplify, really, streamline these processes. Yeah, and then I also talk about the letter of the law and the intent of the law. What usually gets enforced is the intent of the law. What people end up actually doing is the letter of the law, which leads to that checklist stuff. So I do what the letter of the law says, assuming that I'm compliant when it's the intent of the law that's going to be enforced. The trick is to manage risk well, to do security well, and then you'll automatically be compliant. So we even fit compliance into information security as opposed to the other way around. All right, so hopefully that all made sense. Those were just basics, fundamentals, with hopefully a little context that helped you out. So we've got identity authentication, authorization, and accounting. Or accountability. Accounting, they're used interchangeably. IAAA. The first is identity. Identity is just you claim to be somebody. There's no proof that you are somebody, and it could be in any kind of entity. It could be an application, could be a process, could be a person, could be whatever. They're just identifying themselves to a system. There's no valid proof. In this case, I'm Brad. My username is B9. So name, username, ID, employee number, those are all identifiers. We have an issue in real life when you talk about Social Security numbers, which is all tied to a person's identity. One of the problems with the Social Security numbers is that same identifier is used for identification, but it's also used for authentication in some places. And so you violate kind of these fundamental rules, and that leads you to a whole bunch of problems. So it should be non-descriptive, but they are often descriptive. Most organizations adopt a naming scheme that is descriptive. So in the case that I used there with I am Brad, username is B9. That's descriptive, right? We know once you figure out one, you kind of figured out all of them, which doesn't help for information gathering. And we'll go through that eventually too. The typical attack sequence. One of the things in an attack sequence is information gathering. We might use OSINT, we might use any number of things, but we're trying to find out what the pattern is for usernames so that we can go after specific ones. So it should be non-descriptive. Without proof, it's just an identity. So you need to authenticate, you need to prove yourself. So that's where authentication comes in. It's proof. Your authentication is only as strong as the proof. That's why passwords are often disclosed. People choose weak passwords. That's a weak authentication. We'll talk about strong authentication is multi-factor authentication. So the strength of your proof ends up being the strength of your authentication. Proof that I am who I say I am. A subject proves identity to another subject or object. Examples: passwords, PIN codes, pictures, biometrics. We'll get into biometrics. Like a fingerprint scan, a retina scan, facial recognition. All those things are biometrics. Identification, authentication must be separate and ideally different. And I put the Social Security number oops there because we used to use it a lot more often as an identifier and an authenticator. Still happens. An identity is stolen when an authenticator is also stolen, because then I can claim to be you. I know your identifier, and so if I steal your authenticator, I can be you to the system, which then messes up the whole rest of the chain, the identity, authentication, authorization, and accountability. There's no accountability if your identity has been stolen. You don't know if it's you, don't know if it's an attacker. There's no way to point it out to, and that really hurts when you do investigations. So again, important: subjects are active, objects are passive. These are factors of authentication. So a password, PIN code, picture, biometric, mobile phone, pass token, YubiKey. Those are all different types of authentication and different factors. These are the factors. You'll need to know this really well, and you'll need to be able to explain it to people really well in practice. So there are three factors. There's something you know, something you have, and something you are. Some people will claim that there's a fourth factor with geolocation, where somewhere you are. It's getting more and more popular as technology gets, I think, more and more granular there. But officially, it's not a factor of authentication for the exam and in most applications. So something you know, something you have, and something you are. Something you know would be your password, PIN code. Every time you go to the ATM machine, you're doing multi-factor authentication. You have something you have, the card, and something you know, your PIN code. That's multi-factor authentication. Good example that everybody does, or most people do. Something you have, tokens, phones, something physical that you have, a debit card with a smart, a smart card, a smart chip. Something you are, biometrics, finger, face. It's something that I am. Two or more factors is multi-factor authentication or strong authentication. We also use acronyms like MFA or 2FA, all the same thing. So understanding this and being able to explain it to others is going to be very important for you for the exam and in real life. MFA can be hacked. So we're always looking for this silver bullet, looking for the easy button with things. So there was a time, I think, when many people thought that if I replace single-factor authentication, which would be just a password, weak authentication, if I replace that with a multi-factor authentication, then I'm good, right? But you're not. You'll never find that silver bullet. There's always a way to get around something. But MFA can be hacked. And this is just a good reference if you're interested in reading more about this. Roger's a good friend of mine. He wrote a great article. Actually, this led to a whole bunch of things. He spoke at RSA about this. Just 11 ways to defeat two-factor authentication. And now that's actually expanded. I think he knows 20 or 30 different ways to defeat two-factor authentication. It's important to know because if you are one of those people who thinks, okay, I put in multi-factor authentication, I'm good. It's good to know what your weaknesses are so then you can consider the threats and then consider the risks. So a good read by Roger. He's also written like 1 billion books. I have one here somewhere. This one. This is a good book. Data-driven security defense. All right, here we go. Identification, authentication, that's what it looks like. That's actually a screenshot from the book. Identification, just your username, and authentication, just your password. All right, so once a subject has identified and the subject has authenticated, the next thing the system needs to do is to determine what you can do with the system itself and what you can do with data on the system. So this is, we're getting down that path. So it's what actions a subject is permitted to perform, read, write, execute, but it's also privileges. Privileges and need to know and data access are different. So privileges, rights, and permissions, those are typically things that would relate to the system itself, what I can do with the system. Read, write, execute is related to the data. Those are both examples of authorization. Identify, authenticate, authorize. Now the last piece is accountability, and we're going to get to that in a later domain, but accountability is, essentially logging, cookie crumbs that you leave in the system. It becomes really important for troubleshooting, becomes really important for incident response, all those things. That's the last A, would be accountability. If you violate any one of those, you violate essentially all of them. This is just another article that was written if you're interested in reading these things, where I just explained the difference between identity management and identity and access, or identity and authentication, I guess, management, but really identity and access management. The issue at hand is a lot of people, when they try to tackle identity management or identity and access management, is they try to tackle it all at once. You try to tackle identity and access management all at once. Really, the best way to do it is tackle identity management first, get your user accounts and all those things sort of squared away, and then go after the access management. And that's really the point of the article. But they are two different functions, integrated, can't be separated, but they are different from each other. And then just some examples of that if you find these things fascinating. You won't have to go in, this stuff won't be in the exam. I think it's more just in practice. It's good things to know. Yeah, when you're practicing things. That's the link to the article. And if you read these things, I'd love to hear feedback. I'm always open to feedback to tell me didn't make sense, I disagree, whatever. We're all in this together, so nobody has all the answers. So when you get people who tell you different perspectives, it's really, really important. All right, so the need to know always applies to data. So a subject is authorized or permitted by the system to do something doesn't mean that the subject should do something. The principle of need to know still applies. So just because I have access, this plays a lot in healthcare too. You've probably read stories of clinicians or people with billing departments within hospitals that will review medical records of a famous person maybe that visited that hospital. There's no need to know for that person to access that data. But they did, and then they get in trouble, all that stuff. That's a classic sort of need to know scenario. There's no need to know, so don't access it. Just because I can doesn't mean I should. That's need to know. Least privilege is always tied to rights. So rights is the system. So least privilege is system, need to know is data or information. Violation of least privilege can easily violate the need to know principle because I can change access rights, right? If I have elevated access to a system or excessive privilege on a system, oftentimes that leads to me being able to change access to files and violate the need to know. That's what that's about. All right, again, the third time tonight, you guys have seen this now. Subject active, object passive. There's examples, user services applications. Objects are things that are inanimate, things that don't move, things that don't change. At that time. They may change later, but at the time of whatever access, the object was static. It wasn't changing. So subjects and objects. You can be and I mentioned this already, you can be a subject at one time and be an object at another and then be back to a subject again. So it's all about a point in time. When you see this in the exam, they'll give you a point in time and then ask you if this is a subject or an object, for whatever. So I mentioned it, very testable. That's why it's here 3 times. It is very testable, and it's fundamental. I mean, you'll carry this with you. This isn't one of those things that you can, just go ahead and forget later. This will be something that you'll take with you. Super important. Hopefully I've driven that home now. Like, this is really a big deal. All right, due care and due diligence. These are things that are often debated because it's never black and white, due care and due diligence. So really it comes down to, and we're going to get to this more, what the Prudent Man Rule. What would a prudent person, somebody with in the same situation with good common sense, the same information, what would they do? What would be reasonable? So these are just questions. Is it reasonable to not conduct an information security risk assessment? It used to be a lot more reasonable to not do those things, but it's become a lot less reasonable today. It used to be reasonable to be ignorant. It wasn't uncommon, and you still see some executives who don't want to do a risk assessment because they'll claim, well, if I know about something, then I got to do something, which doesn't hold water anymore. So it's kind of an illogical argument. In information security, that used to hold water, but now ignorance it's not as defensible as it used to be. So make logical risk-based information security decisions. Does that seem reasonable? Because this is what will happen. I've seen it happen enough times that when there's a breach, when something bad happens, and we know that this is about risk management, not risk elimination, so something bad will happen. That's just the way it works. When that bad thing happens, how defensible am I? because these are the types of questions that you'll get asked potentially, probably from opposing counsel, assuming that this becomes some kind of a civil litigation thing. You didn't conduct a risk assessment. Why didn't you conduct a risk assessment? I mean, you just lead down this line of questioning that makes people very, very uncomfortable. So the answer to it is to do the right things. And to combat the logic with executives or people who think that, well, if I know something, then I got to do something. To combat that logic, if you do a risk assessment, a quantified risk assessment, and the one that we do often is that S2 org assessment. Let's say that I score a 400 on a scale of 300 to 850. That's bad. So if I just left it at that, would I be negligent? Probably. If I move that 400 to a 401, so I'm nowhere near the good range yet, but I made progress, that becomes more defensible, right? You're making progress. Progress is defensible. So doing a risk assessment, not doing a risk assessment is probably not defensible. And I'm not a lawyer, but I've just seen these things play out. If I did a risk assessment and it's poor and I didn't do anything about it, that's also probably going to be less defensible. If I just do minor things and integrate these things into my business, that becomes much more defensible. So that's the point here. Between due care and due diligence, due care is really the concept. Due diligence is the actual practice of due care. So this is me. I'm not a lawyer. And it's funny, I've been challenged on this before. When I was being interviewed for the Target Special Litigation Committee, when the Target breach happened, it was December 19th, 2013 is kind of when the news broke. And I remember that 'cause it was my birthday. And I was out having dinner with family, and I got a call. Care 11, which is a news organization out this way, called and said, "Hey, we want to come do a story about the Target breach." And at the time, I hadn't even heard about it yet. I was like, "Yeah, I guess." And I figured I'll just read about it on my phone on the way driving into the studio. So I did that, and I'm like, "Oh wow, all right, this seems bad." There weren't a lot of details at the time, but anyway, did the interview. A couple of crazy things. That interview ended up on USA Today's homepage. Just weird. But I had written an article about it. I wrote an article on a blog about, is Target negligent? Were they negligent by the fact that they didn't do anything about vendor risk management or didn't do something sufficient? So I wrote this thing, and then I was interviewed for the Special Litigation Committee. I don't know how they found me, but when I was in the interview for that, and the really powerful lawyer people, like the former Chief Justice of the Minnesota Supreme Court, Kathleen Blatz, was on the committee. She was there interviewing me, and it was just really uncomfortable. One of the questions that they asked was, "Are you a lawyer?" I'm like, "No, I'm not a lawyer." "Oh, because you wrote this article and it really seemed like you were giving legal advice." I'm like, "Well, sorry about that." And then they sort of warned me not to do that again. I'm like, it was inadvertent. But anyway, I'm not a lawyer. I have worked with a bunch of lawyers over the years, and these are the things I know about lawyers. Due care and due diligence are really big deals, and they're not black and white. We did a lot of discussion in that Special Litigation Committee, just that. And if it were me making the recommendation to the court on how to proceed, I would have found them negligent, but I'm not a lawyer. The recommendation from the Special Litigation Committee, and you can look this up on the internet, was to not proceed with the case. So it would have gone against what I thought, but this was what was debated, for the entire 21 months. This is especially in civil cases. Now, the reason why civil cases, and we'll talk about this too, is because in civil cases, it's preponderance of evidence. That's what tips the scale one way or the other. Whereas in a criminal case, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So there's always this, did I tip the scale a little bit more this way or that way? Whereas a criminal case should be cut and dry. It should be black and white. It should be, there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, that kind of thing. So this is where due care and due diligence really play a big role. They help to establish negligence. So when you hear negligence or liability, those are all kind of tied in together. I also know that lawyers have a different sense of humor. There's some stories around this. Yeah, it's not uncommon for me to crack jokes, not jokes, but loosen up the atmosphere a little bit. Certainly trying to be part of the group, right? And so you're sitting with a bunch of lawyers, and I don't do this anymore, but it's happened where I said something I thought was funny. It wasn't one of these stupid dad jokes. It was actually something I thought was funny, and they all looked at me like I was crazy. And then they would say something that I thought was just dumb, and they're all laughing. So definitely a different sense of humor than me. And they make a lot of money by charging by the hour. Yeah. Anyway, so that's that. Those were our cornerstone concepts, and I don't think they were difficult for us. They are foundational. We will need to master those. We will need to memorize those not before we move on, and now we'll move on. So another dumb dad joke, because I don't know. I guess I run the slides. So why do melons have weddings? Yeah, some of you guys will know this one. Because they can't cantaloupe. Get it? They can't elope. They can't elope because they can't cantaloupe. They can't elope. All right, dumb. All right, now into legal systems. 4 major legal systems that are covered on the exam. There are many, many, many legal systems throughout the world, but these are the 4 major ones that'll be covered in the exam. Civil law, not to be confused with the civil type of law within common law. Those are different. Civil law, common law, religious law, and customary law. Customary law is the one that I think is the most kind of gray. If you just operate in the United States, chances are very good you're operating all under common law. Different parts of the world, just understand that if you're working in a global organization or working in an organization that's located in a different part of the world, or you've maybe moved there, might be a whole different set of laws. So it's good to get accustomed to what laws you're working with. So don't confuse the law legal system with the civil law within the common law. Not to confuse you, but that's really the only kind of one that I think gets really confusing when you talk about the legal systems and the types of law within those legal systems. This is the most common one, the civil law legal system. This is not the one used in the United States. This is the one that's used, primarily throughout Europe. Australia uses common law, but civil law, the most common one. Codified laws and statutes. So, usually it's a legislative body of some sort that codes the law or creates the statute. And then it's a judicial body. So much like the United States, where you have the judicial body that then interprets the law. And you usually have a law enforcement piece as well. The big thing about civil law is that there's really no precedent. They don't put a lot of weight on previous case law. So as cases, get interpreted by the courts, they don't really put any weight to, what did this other court in this other jurisdiction, how did they interpret the law? Because I'm going to take that into consideration in how we're going to interpret the law. It's just every interpretation is pretty much whatever that jurisdiction interprets the law to be at that time. So not a lot of judicial precedent, or in some cases none. But that's civil law. Everything else, pretty much like the United States, which is the common law system, is pretty much the same. It's just the precedent piece. That's why I highlighted that. I thought this was a super cool graphic. If you want to know which laws kind of apply in which different parts of the world, you can see the pink. Those are common law. So that's us here in the United States, Australia, England. You can see all throughout Europe, all throughout pretty much South America, it's all civil law. It's just a cool graphic. It just comes from Wikipedia, but it's cool. Yeah, hopefully that helps you. I mean, certainly if you're operating in different parts of the world, it should. All right, so common law is the legal system in the United States, Canada, UK, others. It'll be the one that's most likely to be on the exam. If they don't mention what legal system it is, assume that it's common law. If they do say, the legal system, then it's that legal system. But if it's absent of mentioning a specific one, it's going to be common law. Codified laws and statutes. So we have Congress who writes laws and does all that stuff. So legislative body, and we're not going to get into civics all that much, but they're the ones who create the laws and pass the laws. The president in the United States signs them into law. There's a lot of weight given to judicial precedent. So how one court interprets the law plays a big role in how another court will interpret the law. And in previous, even within the same court, right, all those precedents really carry a ton of weight, which, there's pluses and minuses, I think, to both of those. This allows laws, I think, to continually be redefined. So not redefined, but refined. Because when a law is initially written, it's hard to read in a lot of cases, the intent behind that law. But as it gets interpreted by the courts, it becomes a lot more focused. So that's that. Within the common law legal system, there are three types of laws: civil law, criminal law, and administrative law. You'll need to know these. You'll need to know the basics of these. So these are very testable. The first is criminal law. So that's where society itself is viewed as the victim. There's usually some type of removal from society associated with criminal law. The important thing about criminal law is it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt. They deter crime, punish offenders. That's what criminal law is all about. Incarceration, financial penalties, and or execution. So criminal law, the things to remember are the things that are on this slide. The victim is society, proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and there's usually something worse that comes from it. Handcuffs. All right, in civil law, it's usually the victim is viewed as a person or an entity, not society as a whole. This is where preponderance of evidence comes into play. This is where liability comes into play. Most commonly between private parties. It's sort of, and it's not uncommon actually, to have a single act or a single event be prosecuted under criminal law and civil law. You saw that, I guess a classic one that comes to mind right now is O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty of the criminal offenses, but was found liable in the civil case that followed after. So, he was sued for, millions of dollars. Whatever, the story. So that was an instance where an act or a series of events was prosecuted under both laws. That's not uncommon. Damages are financial, often, most often. You have statutory damages, and statutory damages are those that are prescribed by the law. They're written into the law that this is the penalty for doing whatever it is that you did. You don't have to, if I'm the victim, I don't have to demonstrate that I suffered any harm from this in order to, prosecute, collect maybe, statutory damages. Compensatory damages are those where I do have, I suffered some harm, something bad happened to me, and I suffered for it. In that case, those are compensatory damages. They're meant to compensate me as a victim for whatever loss I had. In those cases, you have to demonstrate that you had a loss if you're going for compensatory damages. Punitive damages are like to punish you. It was so, maybe the act was so egregious that we want to make an example out of you. So we're going to sue you for $6 billion or whatever. That would be, punitive damages. The burden of proof in civil law, the civil law type within the common law legal system, is preponderance of evidence. Tipping the scale. See the scale? Yeah. All right. Administrative law. So administrative law is signed in. It goes through the same process, right? We've got the legislative body who does their thing and brings the bill forth, passes it all, and then the president signs it into law. The enforcement of that law, then, in administrative law, is some government entity, some agency, something like that is going to take that law, enact it, and enforce it. So legislature, president issues the administrative law, the agency itself. So think of GLBA, for instance. GLBA is interpreted by the FFIEC, and then it's enforced through that umbrella of the FFIEC, which includes, the FDIC, the OCC, so on and so forth. In HIPAA is another example of an administrative law. The Department of Health and Human Services is the one who interprets that law and enforces that law. And they all do it differently, so it makes it a little bit challenging if you kind of governed by multiple. Now, if you do security the way it's meant to be, because all these laws are pretty reasonable in what the intent is, and if it comes to security, the intent is often to manage risk well, to make good risk decisions. So if you're doing that, you'll probably be pretty close to compliant with most of these administrative laws. Because they're all enforced differently. Like the FDIC will go and examine banks all the time. OCC the same way. In healthcare, there's no real audit that's done by the Department of Health and Human Services. They started to go down that path a while back and then abandoned it. And now the OCR, the Office for Civil Rights, investigates violations. So they don't enforce it actively, they investigate violations. And it takes a long time. I don't know if you've been on the other side of this before. Blue Cross Blue Shield, for instance. The OCC's already done their investigation. They haven't issued their corrective action plan, so it's called a CAP. They haven't issued that yet. So they're still kind of in limbo. They don't know what the fine is going to be. Usually with a CAP, there's a series of things that have to be accomplished within specific time frames. And usually there's a hefty fine associated with it. In our own neck of the woods here in Minnesota, Fairview had a CAP. North Memorial had a CAP. And if they're coming to investigate, they are going to find something. And when they find something, be as nice as you can and just go with it. I've read so many stories where people try to fight in administrative law situations. The court that you're appealing to is maintained by the agency. So the agency has their findings, then you appeal their findings, you're appealing to them. The court is them, the judge is them, any jury, if there's anything like that, will be them. So it's kind of a futile attempt. And if you make them, it sounds dumb, but if you make them angry, it just gets worse and worse. And I was at Black Hat Executive Summit in 2014, something like that. They only had one of them, which was really sad. But there was a guy there, I can't remember his name, but he gave a talk about his experience in trying to fight the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and it ended up putting him out of business. It got that bad. So my advice usually and again, I'm no lawyer, with administrative law is to kind of be as nice as you can and hope that penalty is as little as it can be. All right, so if you're on the bad side of this, I feel for you. Go for it. All right, so liability. Liability is, who is going to pay, right? And that's just human nature, right? Something bad happens to me, I got to point a finger, I got to hold somebody accountable, I got to know why. We get this in incident response all the time, and we call that attribution. Who did it? Where did they come from? So it's normal, but liability is who should be held accountable. Sometimes you can't hold anybody accountable, sadly. Who should we blame? Who should pay? Who should make me whole? Those are all things, related to liability. We apply that prudent man rule, the due care and due diligence. What would a prudent person do if I fall below? So that'll establish some sort of a gray dotted line, right? The prudent man rule. If I fall below that line, I'm negligent or liable. That's where liability sort of lies. As long as I stay above that line. So what this ends up creating in our industry is it creates a herd mentality. So when you deliver results of something to executives or a board, one of the very common questions is, well, how do we rate? Where are we in relation to everybody else? They're asking these questions because a lot of it is because of this. It's because of liability. As long as I'm within the range, I'm in the herd, I'm probably safe. If I start falling outside of the herd, it might be liable, it might be negligent. Now the key is the key with security is to focus on yourself, to focus on your own risk, to make your own risk decisions, regardless of what the herd is doing. In a perfect world, that's the way we do it, as opposed to trying to be where everybody else is with liability. I don't know what the fix is necessarily for that. And just the definition of liability. All right, legal aspects of investigation. So, and we'll get deeper into forensics and things like that. And even then, we won't go real deep into forensics, but enough to where you can make good decisions if you're responsible at a high level for it, or good enough to identify if that's a place that you want to specialize. So when you look at information security and look at all the stuff that you can do in information security, you can specialize in law, you can specialize in governance, you can specialize in risk management, you can specialize in third-party risk management, you can specialize in policy, whatever. You might decide that forensics looks pretty exciting to me. I'm going to focus in forensics. You'll get that from this class, but all you'll get from this class is just a kind of an intro to what it is. So collecting and handling evidence is a critical legal issue. It will always be challenged in court, I would assume. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm careful with that, but it's very commonly challenged in court. The quality of the evidence, how the evidence was protected, where the evidence came from, those are all things that are often challenged. Even the expertise of the person who collected that evidence will be challenged. Whatever it takes to tip the scale in the other way is open. So some evidence is more important than others. In general, the evidence must be relevant to the case. So whatever case you're trying to make with the evidence, it needs to be relevant to that. It needs to be authentic, meaning it came from a source that makes it authentic and it wasn't changed. Accurate, complete, and convincing. Those are the 5 things for all evidence, and that's really critical. So the 5 types of evidence. So this is different than that other. This is the actual types of evidence. The first is real evidence. Real evidence is tangible evidence. Computer evidence is never real evidence. It's always hearsay evidence, but they codified some things, some exceptions to make it still admissible in court, because typically hearsay evidence won't be admissible in court. But real evidence is tangible, it's physical. So a computer hard drive is real evidence. The data in the hard drive is not real evidence because it's not tangible, it's all logical. Direct evidence is firsthand eyewitness testimony, or not necessarily eyewitness, but firsthand witness testimony. I might have heard something, might have even tasted something, smelled something. Most cases it's you saw something. Non-firsthand evidence, so if it's evidence secondhand or thirdhand, that's all fits under hearsay evidence. Circumstantial evidence is kind of everything around the facts that you're trying to establish, but it's not real evidence, so it's not hard evidence. It just establishes all the circumstances that something could have happened or something did happen around the real evidence. So circumstantial evidence is all about the circumstances. Usually not good by itself. You want to look for, if you can, look for real evidence. In computer crimes, it's probably not going to happen. So then you look for real, solid hearsay evidence. Corroborative evidence is just strengthens a fact or element of the case, but by itself it doesn't establish anything or nothing relevant. Hearsay evidence, secondhand evidence. So secondhand evidence. So when you think of a computer system, it's always secondhand, right? There was an action that took place that would be the direct or real evidence, and then it resulted in something on the computer. So that would be the hearsay. That's what makes it secondhand. So even creating a file is secondhand evidence opposed to like what you were doing with the computer, your fingers moving and all that other stuff, which would be real evidence. So normally considered inadmissible in court, there are 2 rules. There's Rule 802 and exceptions to Rule 803. So these are those I guess exceptions to that hearsay rule that still makes computer generated evidence, including log files, images, disk images, things like that, still makes them admissible in court. So general inadmissibility, and you can go look these up. These are online if you're into this stuff. Rule 802 is the federal rules of evidence. They're what is permitted and what's not permitted. All this is in the federal rules of evidence. Rule 802 by itself, if we didn't have these exceptions in 803 and 804, you'd never be able to use computer files or data in court. So business and computer generated records, logs, are generally considered to be hearsay evidence. And here's the quote from 803 that makes it admissible in certain circumstances. So made at or near the time by or from information transmitted by a person with knowledge if kept in the course of a regularly conducted business activity. That's pretty important. A regularly conducted business activity. I've seen cases or read cases where we made a change to a regularly conducted business activity in order to catch somebody in the act of doing something they shouldn't have been doing with our computers or something like that. You can get evidence thrown out because it wasn't a normal, regularly conducted business activity. So the important thing here is to plan ahead and make your HR things that you do, the tools that you use to collect evidence. That's all just regularly conducted things that you do, because if not, there's kind of some wiggle room there. And if it was a regular practice of business activity, to make the memorandum, report, record, or data compilation. So the important things in that 803, I think, admissibility piece is at or near the time of whatever, and that it was a regularly conducted business activity. So the closer to the time period makes it more relevant. If you go back to the quality of the evidence, relevance is number one. Hopefully that made a lot of sense. I need to get something to drink now because I'm talking too much. All right, much better. All right, we always preserve the original. So if you're ever doing forensics, you never, ever do your investigation on original copies. I can't think of a circumstance where I would have to do that, unless maybe you're doing live forensics. So live forensics is just another type of forensics. Live forensics is where we're trying to capture things maybe that are in memory. So if I unplug the computer or shut the computer down, I just wiped all the evidence that might have been running in memory. Now this is a bigger deal nowadays because there are many exploits, many malicious things that happen that never write anything to disk. So we often don't want you to shut down a computer system unless it's like spreading something. But if it's unusual activity or just unauthorized access, it isn't spreading like a worm. It usually makes sense to leave that computer on. But other than that, we never do investigations on originals. If a computer's been shut down, we capture the computer. And you really can't be too, I don't know if the word's anal, but you can't be too careful with this. The rule of thumb in the instance that I've done is if you're going too fast to document everything, you're going too fast. I also take pictures of everything. It's better to have too much than not enough. And there's usually not a huge urgency to doing investigations, forensic investigations. It's not a huge rush typically. So you're not going to miss anything if you take your time and be very deliberate on how you do the investigation. Even to the point where I've done investigations where I've arrived on site and I've taken pictures of the office, the way the office was set up, where the computer was sitting at the time that I walked in, and all that stuff, because I never know if I'm going to be asked those things. I never know if I'm going to be asked, well, how did you find the computer? And I'm like, I don't remember. If I have pictures to support that stuff, so I start the investigation even then. I might even record the phone call when I got the phone call of something bad happened. But you need to be that kind of deliberate when you do that. So preserving the original, creating a binary copy. A binary copy isn't just a copy, right? A binary copy is a bit-for-bit copy of the data. Really important. So Rule 1001 allows for the admissibility of that binary disk, the image of the disk. So it's okay. You don't need the original in court, right? You don't need the investigation of the original in court. 1001 allows you to create a binary image of that disk or of that whatever, the data, and conduct your investigation on that. Now you'll need to provide evidence and support that the binary image is in fact an image of the original, and we would use checksums and things like that. There's all types of software that you would use to do this, and a lot of the stuff is built in. But Rule 1001 allows for the admissibility of the binary disk image if data are stored in a computer or similar device, any printout or other output readable by sight shown to reflect the data accurately. That's the part where a checksum really comes into play. A checksum just validates that nothing changed. If I do a checksum of the original, which doesn't change the original, and then I create a binary image and create a checksum of that binary image and the two match, that's enough to support 1001, assuming I used a good hash algorithm, which we'll also cover later on. So don't worry about that. If you don't understand what a hash algorithm is at this point, we'll get to that. Opposing counsel, almost certainly, I would assume, I mean, if I was opposing counsel, I would certainly question the validity of the data. If the data was damning to my client, I'd want to challenge it. Like, tell me the tools you used, tell me the steps you went through. Looking for any crack in either the chain of custody or the quality of the data itself, the tools that I used, or whatever. Really important to document everything. Document everything. All right, so legal aspects of investigation. So we had that best evidence rule. The best evidence is direct evidence, and then it kind of gets worse from there. Courts do prefer best evidence whenever possible. Evidence, again, we went through this. Relevant, authentic, accurate, complete, and convincing. Those are the 5 things that your evidence needs to be in order to really be used in court. Direct evidence is always best. We know that in computers, that's not going to happen. So you do your hearsay evidence, and that just makes it that much more important than that you follow the rules and get those binary images, you follow chain of custody, document everything, and all that stuff. Secondary evidence is common in cases involving computers. Copies, originals, logs, all that stuff is secondary evidence. Chain of custody becomes really, really important because they'll ask about it. Who had access to this drive, who did what and when. Prosecuting computer crimes is hard, and the reason why it's even harder is because they have to have this proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'll give you just a quick scenario. I could be sitting in, I'm in Minnetonka now, and I could be attacking a company in, let's say, Minneapolis, which is like 15 miles away. If I proxy my traffic through open proxies in China, Iran, Russia, there are open proxies on the internet in those countries, and then I filter all my traffic through there. So I appear that I'm coming from here, and if you backtrack to try to find attribution, chances are better that I'm not going to be prosecuted, because it's not uncommon for law enforcement agencies or countries to not cooperate with the United States. So when you try to collect that evidence, you may not be able to get it. And if that's the case, then that's an open part of the equation, enough potentially to give a reasonable doubt. So just prosecuting computer crimes is hard. What usually happens in computer crime prosecutions is they usually settle without going to trial for a number of reasons. So that's what usually happens with prosecuting computer crimes. These are just examples of a chain of custody form. If you're working in if you're working in this industry, in my opinion, there's really no excuse for not having an incident response plan or an incident management plan, whatever you want to call it. It essentially lines out what you're going to do when an incident occurs. Now, if you challenge yourself, you know that an incident's going to occur, right? Because you can't eliminate risk. So then, if I know that an incident is going to occur eventually, and I didn't plan for the inevitable, you kind of start leaving yourself in kind of a precarious situation. And it's not that much work, right? Creating an incident response plan and then implementing that. Will take work, but it's not terribly difficult. Really, really important. We'll get more into incident response and incident management as we get further on in the domains. But part of that incident management plan is, what are you going to do for forensics? And you can put that we're going to use this third-party forensic firm, and put their contact information or whatever in the incident response plan if you want to. That's fine. But if you're going to try to take this on yourself, you need to have things like chain of custody. You need to have some forensic procedures in place. You just have to. So having an incident, what you'll see in most of the incident response plans that I've created and we create have a chain of custody form in it. And even if you're going to do an outside forensic firm, it's still a good idea to have that chain of custody form, because you may need to ship the system or the drive or the evidence to a third party. In that case, you'd attach a chain of custody form. Just a lot of reasons. So have a chain of custody form. Lots of templates you can email me and I'll give you a template for it. Really important. All right, evidence integrity. The quality of the evidence will be challenged in court. Hopefully I made that case well enough, or at least assume it will be. Any gaps that you leave, opportunities for exploitation by somebody who's not working on your behalf. The integrity of the evidence is critical forensic function. Checksums are used. MD5, surprisingly, is still a checksum, still a hash algorithm that's used for checksums, even though it's weak. But SHA-1, we'll get more into checksums later on in the different hashing algorithms. Hashing algorithms are just one-way functions that create a fixed data out of variable data, right? So it's just a one-way function. You can't reverse it the other way. So I can't recreate the data from the hash. And if two different datas or two different inputs hash to the same number or the same hash, that's called a collision. That's what makes it weak. So MD5 is more prone to collisions than others. Don't worry about memorizing that right now. We're going to get into that more later on. We cover that a lot. All right, this is a pretty good article. If you want to read more, it's not required for passing the exam, but it's good information. So understanding forensic copies and hash functions from data narrow, it's good. Just a reference. All right, other things about investigations. The biggest thing about the Fourth Amendment as a practitioner, I don't work in law enforcement, and Fourth Amendment only applies to law enforcement. Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to me as a private citizen. So there's nothing to stop me if I follow the proper process and procedure within the organization. There's nothing, I'm not going to worry about violating the Fourth Amendment if I go and collect evidence from somebody who was doing something they shouldn't have been doing, at work, something like that. That's not a Fourth Amendment issue. Fourth Amendment only applies to law enforcement. Now, where this can really get me in trouble is if law enforcement tells me to do something and I do it, now I'm operating under color of law, and now the Fourth Amendment does apply to me. So understanding that this is one of many reasons why the first step in an investigation is not to call law enforcement. That's one reason, because if law enforcement says, oh, we'll go do this, and then you go do that, you might be operating under color of law, which then you're violating the Constitution. That's a bad thing. That's one reason. Another reason is there's so much variability in different law enforcement agencies in their technical skills, in their forensic abilities, and all those other things. That if I call, the local police department here, I may not get what I was hoping to get in terms of an investigation. And I guess another reason is when one big thing in incident response is to control the message. You control the message internally to the organization, but you also need to control the message, publicly. When law enforcement comes and takes control of an investigation, I easily can lose control of the message. So just, careful when you get law enforcement involved. I'm not anti-law enforcement by any means. I love our law enforcement. It's just in the computer or in incident investigations, probably not your best first call. If you call the FBI, depending on the case, they're not going to take it. That I think I told you on Monday about the, or maybe I didn't. I don't know, 800. The last it's been a year or two since my last investigation. We got a whole team that does that awesome stuff now. But one of the last ones I did was $830,000 of unauthorized ACH transfers. And it took them too long to figure it out, so you couldn't claw back. And so we called, and we needed, they were transferred to another state in another bank. And so in order for us to continue the investigation, we needed some form of subpoena power. So we called the FBI, and they wouldn't take the case, just for whatever reason, right? Maybe it wasn't impactful enough to national security, impactful enough to a wide enough range of people. That's one factor, or the dollar amount didn't exceed what they're willing to do. So even calling the FBI probably won't produce much fruit. Call them later, or call them maybe. You can call them and maybe report it to the IC3, so at least gets in their reporting statistics. But for them to do the investigation, probably not going to happen. All right, so law enforcement needs a search warrant. That's how you get the Fourth Amendment. Everything else is unlawful, unreasonable search and seizure. They need a search warrant issued by the judge. Here are some exceptions. Plain sight. So plain sight would be they're in a public area or in a public, and they can see the evidence. That's a plain sight exception. Public checkpoints, those are legal. So, but that's probably not going to apply much to computers. Exigent circumstances. So there's an immediate threat that human life or evidence destruction may occur. I suppose law enforcement could make a case there, right? Because a lot of times computer data is dynamic. It's not static. So I suppose they could play that card if they wanted to, the exigent circumstances. And again, the Fourth Amendment. So those are the three real exceptions. The Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to me as a person or you as a person unless you're in law enforcement or unless you're operating under the color of law. Really important to know that. Don't want you guys to get in trouble with violating the Constitution of the United States. So some of you are not even in the United States. Some of you that are online, this will be on the exam anyway, so this will still apply, at least for the exam. You have your own country laws in terms of dealing with Constitution stuff. Two other things that are important for the exam for sure: entrapment and enticement. It all comes down to the intent. So if I can claim that I had no, so I did something, right? It's not really lured, but the opportunity was there to do something criminal, and I had no intent of doing that. That's entrapment. The other is if you can say, well, you had intent to do that, and you were lured and you did the thing, that would be enticement. Entrapment is a valid legal defense. Enticement is not. So it's difficult sometimes to declare intent behind the actions that were taken. And this comes into play for us, I think most often, at least the times I've seen it happen, is with honeypots. So I set up a honeypot. What a honeypot is set up for is usually to conduct intelligence, right? It's to see what the attackers are doing, put something out there that's purposefully weak or vulnerable, and see what the attackers do with it, right? And we can learn a lot of intelligence by the path they take within the system, what they use the system for, how they got into the system, all that stuff can be really good intelligence. But go through your legal department if you're going to do a honeypot, because you get into this entrapment enticement thing. So just be careful when you're doing honeypots. Most people don't do honeypots. There's honey nets, which is a whole bunch of honeypots together in a network. And I think we'll cover more of that in detail later on too. But when I think of entrapment and enticement and how it could apply to me, it's mostly the honeypot piece. All right, intellectual property. You need to know intellectual property stuff too for the exam. Trademarks. The R is a registered trademark. The TM is just a self-declared trademark. It's not registered with the trademark, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. It's not all that expensive to register a trademark. The circle R is the registered trademark, and the TM is the non-registered trademark. Applies to names, logos, symbols, images. I can put a TM on anything. I don't need to go through anybody to get a TM. The circle R, I'd need to get, if I'm going to use that and enforce it, I need to go through the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. And when you do that, there's all kinds of things that can happen. Somebody else could see that trademark and then challenge it at the trademark office, or you could get something registered and later on somebody challenge this as a trademark infringement case. Lots of different things with trademarks and things like that. This is the stuff that you need to know. The superscript SM is a service mark, so it doesn't apply to a specific product. It's more applies to a service. You can see Security Studio and Vendefense. Vendefense was an old name for something that we had a registered trademark for. Still do have the registered trademark, but we've renamed that product. But those are just examples of that circle R. Coca-Cola, there's a circle R, and then we've got AARP, see the SM, that's a service mark. Just examples of how you would apply those in real life. Patents, so patents have to be, what patents are used for is to protect you from all the time, effort, and money you put into inventing something. It gives you some period of time to recoup those costs and profit from your invention before the world can come and use that same invention for themselves. You see this a lot in drugs, in the pharmaceutical industry. So I may spend billions of dollars creating a new drug. If I didn't have patent protection, as soon as I made that drug available to the public, generics would come out and price me out. I would never recoup my costs. So that's just one reason why patents are there. So it's not uncommon for drugs for the first X number of years after it's not going to be the full 20 years because I don't apply for the patent and then have the full 20 years. Usually you apply for the patent and then you got to go through, refinements and clinical trials, FDA approval. I mean, it'll take a while. So I may only get, 10 years, maybe 5 years, to get through all those hurdles before I actually get some profit from it or some money to recoup costs. So that the onus for, in this case for pharmaceutical would be to get it through approvals as quickly as possible so I can get as much protection as I possibly can in the marketplace. But drugs come out in the market and they're, pretty high priced. And then after the patent drops, then that's when the generics come. So that's just one example. The invention has to be novel and unique. Once the patent's been expired, anybody can create the same thing and create the knockoffs however you want to. So it's a legal monopoly for the patent holder. Copyrights. So copyrights software is written, is protected under copyright law. So is, some certain works of art, music, writings, books. Limitations to the copyright law. You'll need to remember these. These will be exam worthy. Fair sale and fair use. So fair sale allows me to sell it on to somebody else. What I can't do is make duplicate copies and sell those copies onto somebody else. It has to be the original thing. I can sell it to somebody else. So, that's what makes garage sales legal, is the fair sale doctrine. So the fair use is I can make duplications for my own use, right? So I don't need the consent of the copyright holder to make copies of, my things. You just can't cross, right? So fair sale and fair use, understanding those two. Licenses, end user license agreements, all types of licenses. Nobody reads them, but they're always there. I don't know. I've read maybe two, but yeah, they're very long, wordy stuff. And a lot of times you don't have a choice. I actually remember I was at, where was I? I was the CISO at eLoyalty, which then became Mattersight. I think Mattersite's still in business. The legal counsel back then actually redlined a Microsoft end user license agreement, and it was for an enterprise software purchase, and expected Microsoft to accept it. Didn't go very far. But contract between the consumer and the provider, the creator of whatever, whoever holds the license for the software or the work, those are licenses. Implied copyright on all artistic works, so you don't have to mark something as being copyrighted. It automatically is copyrighted if you wrote something. So if you write a blog article, it's automatically copyrighted. All artistic works work that way. You can still, so what typically happens is if it's important enough, I'll still take it and get it copyrighted at the Copyright Office. Enforceable term for copyright is 70 years after the death of the author, so that's a long time. Corporate copyright is 95 years after the first publication, or 120 years after creation, whichever comes first. These are testable, unfortunately. You'll have to memorize this, and then you can forget it, because in reality, legal counsel handles these things for the most case. As a security practitioner, I'm not terribly worried about enforcing or wondering if something I'm using is going to be a copyright violation, as long as I'm following normal licensing. But these are the numbers. Trade secrets. Now the thing about trade secrets is interesting. It's almost like a mix between, because trade secrets can be prosecuted under criminal law, a violation of a trade secret. So like, let's say, I'll give you two cases that I worked on briefly. They both settled. A Chinese national is accused of stealing trade secrets from a company. That's going to be prosecuted under criminal law, which it was. The FBI was involved and all that good stuff. But then the trade secret itself, in most cases, they're prosecuted under civil, but in this case, it was prosecuted as criminal, and I think it was because there was a national security sort of interest to it. But it's business proprietary information that's essential for you to differentiate yourself in the marketplace. That's what a trade secret is. Secret sauce, like Coca-Cola's secret recipe or KFC's secret recipe, those would all be trade secrets. Now, what makes a trade secret is that, and it has to be actively protected. And that's where I played a role in these two cases. Was it actively protected? Was it protected like it was a trade secret? If it isn't protected like it's a trade secret, then it's not a trade secret. You can't claim that it's a trade secret. So that kind of, you have that proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This is where it gets kind of fuzzy, right? So you kind of have this mix of civil and criminal. If the organization didn't do what they reasonably should have done to protect that trade secret, it's not a trade secret. So that's important. It becomes really important, because that big differentiator that you had in the marketplace, you lose it, and you lost your differentiation, and you have no recourse. All right, so piracy and copyright infringement, Pirate Bay, BitTorrent, all sorts of places where you can get pirated software. Cyber squatting, typo squatting, these are intellectual property attacks. They're illegal. Cyber squatting and typo squatting, sitting on a domain that you really have no, legal rights to. There's another established organization who does have legal rights because it's close enough to their name, whatever. That's cyber squatting. Typo squatting is, just maybe a letter is off or a couple letters are off. So it's a typo squat, knowing that people sometimes mistype things. Counterfeiting obviously is illegal. Dilution. Dilution just happens over time. If your brand becomes so popular and you've dominated a market for so long, what ends up happening is dilution in that market. Band-Aid and Kleenex are two, kind of classic examples of that. There's China, an entire Apple store copied. So that's a counterfeit, not uncommon. Utybe.com, that would be an example of a typo squat. This is just two of those. These are the two cases actually that I was on. If you're interested in reading about them, they both pled out, so it didn't go to trial, which then shortened, the work that, I had to do with it. So this stuff is public. What actually happened in it all, that stuff you can't share, but it's kind of interesting when you can share kind of, hey, did this thing. if you want to read about it, this would be a trade secret. So central to this case then was this actually protected like it was a trade secret? If it wasn't, then you can't claim it was, and then you can't prosecute like it was. So that became very central to this particular criminal case, right? Same with this one. And in both cases, it was Chinese. All right, and then, yeah, this is just a video. We're not going to watch it now, but if you want to, if you got the slides, you can watch it later. Privacy, now privacy law stuff, right? So we went all through all that stuff. That's a lot of information. We still got more to go, but it's all pretty basic, fundamental, surfacey stuff. You don't have to get real deep into any of this. If you like going deeper into it, feel free. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. Privacy, we've already talked about it. It's confidentiality of personally identifiable information. So not only is it a subset of information security where it only applies to confidentiality, but it's also only a certain type of data, personally identifiable information. So those are the two things, about privacy: confidentiality and personally identifiable information. Examples: social security numbers, protected health information, bank account information, that could all potentially be considered PII, or personally identifiable information. What gets difficult with personally identifiable information is in some cases it's not personally identifiable information. In other cases it is. In some cases neither one of them are personally identifiable information, but you put them together and now it becomes personally identifiable information. So yeah, it's privacy can be a quagmire after a while. Numerous privacy laws throughout the world. The EU General Data Protection Regulation is kind of what reigns supreme right now. CCPA is still trying to figure itself out, I think. But CCPA it is enacted, it is being, it conceivably, enforceable. But I think there's still, like, especially with the whole COVID, with everything that happens with COVID, it's like, is this the time to really start pushing on? There's a lot of debate there. And CCPA, I think in general, is just a really crappy written law. You can read it yourself or talk to a legal counsel about it. Was it one episode of the Unsecurity podcast? We had I can't remember his name, but anyway, we had a legal counsel on to talk about CCPA. It was a really, really good discussion. The value, yeah. The thing is now people are taking privacy more seriously than I think they ever have. The trick is, though, for companies is to get by with it as cheaply and as quickly as possible with whatever the letter of the law is, so that I can defend myself against it, and then sort of stop. And then to the public, you give off this impression like we take privacy really, really seriously, but really it's only enough to get you to continue doing business with them. So privacy is just a mess overall. But for the exam, you need to know these things: PII, confidentiality. You'll need to know maybe a little bit about GDPR, but GDPR may not even be on the test. It's the most applicable today, obviously. And then CCPA, I'm almost certain won't be on the test, but it's good to know in real life. So this was kind of where GDPR sort of started. It was with the EU Data Protection Directive, aggressive pro-privacy law, and there were things written into that law that if I live in a country that doesn't have at least as strict of privacy laws as what's in the EU Data Protection Directive, then I can't do business. That became a big issue because the U.S. you'd stop commerce between the U.S. and the EU. So then they created this EU-U.S. safe harbor to allow still those things to happen. But these are some of the things: notifying individuals of how their data is gathered, where it's used, who it's shared with. All that stuff is really important. Allowing opt-out for sharing with third parties. Opt-in was required for the most sensitive data, which was all outlined in the directive. And reasonable protections. That's a lot of the directive. Excuse me. It was replaced by GDPR effective May 25th, 2018. So we're almost 2 years into GDPR. Other things. So about GDPR itself, designed to harmonize different data privacy laws across Europe. It also enhanced the protections. It made it clearer what the intent is behind the privacy laws. It was published in 2016. You essentially had almost 2 years to get things in order. Now it's kind of in a bigger scale, right? If GDPR comes down to what I'm doing, how I'm accessing, how I'm handling personally identifiable information. What most organizations sort of got stuck with is they had no idea how much personally identifiable information they had. They had no idea where they were sharing it with. So it became sort of an issue. If you would have done information security, I think fundamentally well, it wouldn't have been nearly as disruptive to you to become GDPR compliant. So individuals, organizations, companies that are either controllers or processors of personal data, 99 articles, that those all contain the rights that I have as an individual to protect or know about the information you collect about me. And a good summary there from Adversera. I don't think, like I said, I don't think GDPR is testable, but it is very applicable to the real world. So it's worth it anyway to go and study GDPR a little bit. At least get the basics down. That Adversera website is a great place to get what you need, at least as a start. Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD privacy guidelines. This is not, it's not referenced at all in my work, and I think most of the work of the people that I work with. But it is in the book. It is testable. It's non-mandatory, so I don't need to comply. 8 driving principles. You can see what they are. The collection limitation. I only collect the personally identifiable information that I need to collect in order to conduct business. The data quality principle means that the data that I've collected, the integrity is there, but it also gives users the ability to challenge that on maybe inaccurate data. Purpose specification principle, so it's self-explanatory. Use limitation, so I'm only using it around those things. Security safeguards, openness, individual participation, and accountability principle. Those are the principles around OECD. Beyond that, you don't need to know much more about OECD. If you did want to know more, you can go here. All right, EU-US Safe Harbor. This is probably testable, even though it's not really used anymore. But for use for US companies don't have EU-compliant privacy practices. Otherwise, you couldn't do business with the EU because our laws, our privacy laws, are much less stringent than the EU laws were. Voluntary consent. Yeah, it was a cluster. But anyway, replaced by GDPR. HIPAA, so HIPAA's been around for a long time, 1996, so I guess that makes it 24 years now. Security rule itself, there's privacy rule, security rule, omnibus rule, which really has the breach notification piece in it. 1996, 2003, 2009. It wasn't until 2009 where things got more serious from a security perspective. From 2003 to 2009, it was kind of this half approach to compliance with the security rule. High-tech incentivized people, healthcare organizations to become compliant. There were things called meaningful use requirements. The last meaningful use requirement, if you wanted to get Medicare reimbursement, was to do a risk analysis. So that opened up a lot of opportunity, I think, in healthcare for them to at least get their eyes open to what their risks are. It sort of has fizzled out, since then. There's a lot of things trying to happen, but that's what happened. Omnibus rule in 2013 brought into the breach notification rule, and then it also made HIPAA apply to all business associates. So a business associate, there's covered entities, which is healthcare provider, a hospital, a clinic, things like that, and then there's business associates. Those are people that you're doing business with. The healthcare entity is doing business with. Those are business associates. You need to have a business associate agreement in place. I mean, there's all sorts of requirements here. North Memorial, and I can say it because it's public, but North Memorial got a corrective action plan because of it wasn't that they didn't have a business associate agreement. It's that I don't think they could produce the business associate agreement. At least that's what I remember. So the OCR cracked down on that. So overseen by the Department of Health and Human Services, enforced by OCR. No real audit, no audit protocol, no proactive approach to HIPAA. 3 rules: privacy, security, and breach notification rule. Applies to covered entities and their business associates. Originally passed in 1996, 2003, 2009, 2013. The security rule specifically mandates certain administrative, physical, and technical safeguards. It also mandates a risk analysis. So those things are requirements in HIPAA. One of the kind of things with HIPAA is, a lot of times people say, well, we're HIPAA compliant. That's not the way HIPAA works. There's no like certification to become HIPAA whatever. Not overall with HIPAA. There is things within it, but anyway, that's HIPAA. ECPA. This has been amended multiple times. These are criminal laws. The Electronic Communications Privacy Act actually isn't a criminal one. It really governs more, wiretapping, warrantless wiretapping, things like that. After 9/11, when the Patriot Act followed shortly after that, it was amended and weakened, which means that we lowered the barrier that law enforcement had to get over in order to get wiretaps. And if I didn't get a wiretap, and maybe I should have, it loosened that up too. Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, Title 18. This was enacted in 1986. It's been amended many, many times. Not many times, but a lot of times. This is the law that it's most often used to prosecute computer crimes by far and away. Been amended. You can see the amendments there in 89, 94, 96, 2001, 2002. That came from the Patriot Act, and again in 2008. I think it's been amended another time since then. But the important things to remember about these laws is just what they are and what their intent was. I don't think you'll be asked specifics about when it was amended and how many times it was amended. But know that when you hear Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, that's a criminal law. So it's used to prosecute a computer crime, and then it's the most common one that's used for that. The Patriot Act of 2001, it gave law enforcement a lot more leeway in what they wanted to do for electronic monitoring in terms of snooping on ISP traffic, wiretapping, all that stuff. Allows a lot of search and seizure without immediate disclosure, so you don't even have to tell people that you've taken something. GLBA applies to financial institutions. So the FFIEC, you see the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council. If you just remember FFIEC, you're fine with that. But then there are member agencies under that umbrella. OCC, the Office of Comptroller and Currency, FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, Federal Reserve Board, National Credit Union Association, and on and on. I don't even know what CFPB is, but you don't need to know that. Just know that GLBA applies to financial institutions. You might want to know that it was enacted in 1999, so it's also been around for a while. GLBA is audited against regularly. It is enforced. That also helped with the adoption. Banks sort of took this seriously, much quicker, and it's probably because they had the one thing that everybody really wants, and that's money. So GLBA enforcement happens quite often. California Senate Bill 1386. This was kind of the first breach notification law, or I guess the one that was most emulated throughout the country. It's probably the most famous breach notification law. And so it's just, if a breach happens, this is the law on how you must disclose it. Sarbanes-Oxley Act of 2002. This came from all those financial scandals. I don't know if you remember Bernie Ebbers and Enron and just the crazy days in the 90s. There needed to be a better way to ensure that the financial reporting was accurate, that it was being reported with integrity, because people were making multi-million and billion-dollar transactions, securities transactions based on what was being reported. When those companies collapsed, you would have never known it based on what was being reported. So Sarbanes-Oxley came to do that. Now, from a security perspective, it's all related to financial reporting. So your financial systems, what comes out of the financial system, certainly integrity is a big piece here. Confidentiality, not quite as much. Um, yeah, so that's SOX, and that's basically all you need to know for Sarbanes-Oxley. If you want to know, so in our country, there is no single breach notification law. There are 40, I think all 50 states now have their own breach notification law, and they're all different. Slightly different, big difference, whatever. So the challenge is if you have a breach and it spans multiple countries or multiple states, you have multiple laws to comply with. So certainly legal counsel, they know how to handle this, but it just makes it, I think, less clean than it should be. It'd be nice if there was one federal breach notification law. There's been multiple attempts to get one passed, and it just hasn't happened yet. So there's the link to that. If you're interested in knowing what the different state, if you know your own state, assuming you're in the United States, that's a link you could look at to find out what's your breach notification law. There's also data disclosure laws, and there's data protection laws. The big one that was kind of made things weird, what was it, 2008 was Massachusetts data protection law. That one kind of caused ripples. But most states don't have data protection laws per se. 50 states have enacted breach notification laws. There is no federal breach notification law. Conflicts arise, obviously, when I've got different interpretations, different jurisdictions, different definitions. Safe harbors are provided in some breach notification laws and not in others. An example of a safe harbor would be if your data was encrypted and you can, give reasonable assurance or prove that it was encrypted, it's safe harbored, so you don't have to notify. That's been a big deal because that when you had those safe harbors in place, it really pushed people to do more good security stuff, right? Because if I have a safe harbor for laptop encryption or drive encryption or whatever, well, now I've been trying to get management for years to encrypt their hard drives, but they wouldn't because of performance, whatever excuses they made. We used safe harbors quite a bit to push those things forward. Vendor risk management considerations. I won't go too much into this. I know we're getting close to times, but more accurately, third party. So it's not just necessarily a vendor, it's third parties. It's third parties that I share information with or share access with that have access to or potential access to information. So really it's third party information security risk management. How do you do it? There's about a billion different, not a billion, there's a lot of different ways to do it. Risk assessments, the S2 score is one that obviously we use. SOC 2, SOC 2 Type 1, Type 2, ISO certification, high trust. There's shared assessments, which creates the SIG questionnaires. Have you ever seen those beautiful things? Some people ask for a PCI DSS ROC. Some people do their own custom audit. So, every vendor that you're doing business with needs to be assessed for risk. Not the same way, right? We do all kinds of different things. We do inherent risk first. So inherent is what's the risk involved in doing business with this vendor without accounting for any controls in place at all. So it'd be things like what type of information do I share? How much information do I share? Not asking about controls. We use that to classify the vendor. We put them into one of usually 3 buckets, high, medium, or low. Now the high risk vendors, high inherent risk vendors require a little more scrutiny. We dig deeper for those. But there's no one single way in our industry to do the attestation of vendor or third-party risk. There's a lot of them. BitSite plays in there, security scorecard plays in there, which essentially, scanning system. I mean, there's just so many different ways. So the things that you want is you want to make sure that whatever due diligence you're doing is going to be defensible. If a third party has a breach, did you do your due care? Did you do your due diligence? It's good to have right to penetration test, which is you're probably not going to get, but right to audit certainly is reasonable in contracts. Procurement, where do you fit it into your onboarding process of third parties? You're probably paying third parties. You're either paying them through invoices, you're paying them through credit card reimbursements or credit card statements, that's the place to start to figure out who your vendors actually are. And then you have to integrate with procurement. Every time we bring a new vendor on, are they going to go through the same process to get assessed for risk? Acquisitions, divestitures, if we get rid of things, those are all considerations for vendor risk management. This is very, very testable. So these are our 4 canons. You have to agree to these canons before you'll become certified. Preamble canons, mandatory. Guidance is advisory, but these are mandatory. Protect society is the number 1. So these will be in order. You might see a question on the exam where you kind of see a competing between the 2 canons, and you'll have to choose the right answer based on which canon came first. That's why memorizing these in order is important. Act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibly, and legally. Provide diligent and competent service to principals. Advance and protect the profession. Those are your 4 canons. Always applied in order. 10 Commandments of Computer Ethics. Honestly, I've never memorized these, but these are the 10 Commandments. So anytime you see something in the exam that says "Thou shalt," that would probably fit here. And they're all common sense, mostly, I would think. Thou shalt not use a computer to harm other people, interfere with other people's computer work, snoop around in other people's computer files, use a computer to steal, bear false witness. Don't do any of that. Copy or use proprietary software for which you've not paid, so don't take pirated software. Use other people's resources without giving them some compensation and being authorized to do it. Shouldn't use other people's intellectual output. These are all just, I think pretty fundamental and basic, but in the exam you won't have to memorize these. I'm pretty sure you won't. You'll need to know that the 10 Commandments of Computer Ethics, and if they give you one, maybe need to know where it fits. So it's a good idea to read through it maybe a couple of times, but I wouldn't spend a ton of time really trying to master that. So the 10 Commandments of Computer Ethics, or this is the Internet Activities Board Ethics, IAB. And I geek out about this stuff. So RFCs are requests for comments, and there's RFCs for essentially every internet protocol. RFCs are written, they govern the internet. So there's a ton of history when you look at the index of RFCs. Really cool stuff. But here, the ethics piece is there are RFCs that were written, one RFC, 1087, and this is the unethical behavior: gaining unauthorized access, disrupting the intended use of the internet, wasting resources, destroying integrity, compromising privacy. Those are just in those RFCs. Now, you don't have to memorize the RFCs either, but know that they exist, know that they're used for governing the internet. We're going to get to RFCs again when we talk about computer protocols, when we talk about networks, telecommunications. We're going to talk about RFCs because RFCs govern that stuff. And if you want to, this is cool stuff, right? So you can go to that website that I've got listed there, and if you want to geek out, man, that's pretty darn cool. That's a picture of Steve Crocker. He was RFC number 1. He invented the whole system of RFCs, which is pretty cool. Guy Deloche, he did RFC 8, which is ARPA, which is the early beginnings of the internet, which is super cool. And his original RFC, you can see in that it was all handwritten, which is like super cool. So if you like geeking out about stuff like that, the history of the internet is pretty well documented. A lot of it in the RFCs. Pretty cool stuff. There's a lot of RFCs, so it's not like you're gonna read them all, but maybe read some of the early ones. It's pretty cool. And Steve Crocker is still alive. I think he's like 75 years old. Really cool stuff, man. I admire people that were so inventive to kind of create that stuff. All right, security policy and related documents. These are things we're going to go through quickly. Policies are mandatory. They always kind of have a standard, not standard, but a pretty similar structure to them. Usually there's a purpose, there's a scope. Who does the policy apply to? Responsibilities, and then compliance. These are mandatory things that must be done. That's what policies are for. That's what you'll need to know for the exam. Policy types, there are different types of policies. Program policies, that's high level, kind of applies very wide scope. to the entire program. Issue-specific policies would be defined as, the scope would be a specific issue, and then system-specific policies. So pretty self-explanatory, but policies, things to remember about policies is they're high-level governance documents. They usually don't go into a lot of detail. They're usually, if they're written well, they're very easily referenceable. You don't have to read the entire thing. Those are signs of good policies, but for the exam, they're mandatory. And this is just, contrary to popular belief, and because everybody signs, not everybody, but it's not uncommon for people to sign that I've read and understood the policies, which is, I don't understand why we do that, because nobody reads and understands the policies. And if they sign off saying that they did, then you're kind of starting your relationship off on a lie. So why do it? The way policies work is, if you think about the rules for like a board game, if you were to go to Target and go buy a board game, a new board game, and you're going to sit down with your family and play that board game, how many people read the policy? Just one. How many people? How many people read the rules? Just one. Same thing with policies. Policies are meant to be read by the people whose job it is to interpret and enforce those policies. Otherwise, we make them reference documents, just like the rules in a board game. If somebody questions the rules, I go back to the board game and, oh yeah, you're right. That's how policies are supposed to be used. They're not supposed to be read by everybody. So anyway, that's just a practical thing about policies. Procedures, standards, and guidelines. Now, I usually go kind of the other way with these. If you go policies are high level, then standards and guidelines are kind of the mid level. Procedures are detailed step-by-step instructions to conduct something. Procedures are mandatory, standards are mandatory. Guidelines are always advisory, right? I don't have to comply. You could do this thing to comply with policy. That's what a guideline is. Baselines, benchmarks are also they're sort of rigid, but they're using them as discretionary. And that's the things. So standards usually apply to a specific technology. It's a boundaries around the use of that technology. That would be a standard. Procedures, step-by-steps. Ideally, in a perfect world, every repeatable process that you do should have a procedure. Now, that's nirvana, and it's probably not going to happen, but that would be in a perfect world. All right, switching gears. Personnel security. I'm sorry, I'm running over. I think it was I'm gonna blame it on the technology stuff early on, or something. I'll find somebody to blame. Personnel security considerations. Security awareness training. Two different things. One's awareness. One's training. Training is teaching you to do a specific thing. Awareness is, hey, making you aware of things. Treating them like they're the same thing is a common mistake. Awareness activities, reminders, posters, things like that. Training is, hey, we're going to learn how to identify a phishing email or whatever. So two different things. Background checks, really important. They're static, though. You can only put so much stock into a background check. Background check would tell you if they've committed a crime and been caught for it, been prosecuted for it, potentially. And if I don't do regular background checks on a regular basis, I won't know about any crimes that they've committed and been caught for after we hired them. So if you're going to do background checks, it's a good idea. It certainly protects you from a liability standpoint, because if something bad happened, you can say, well, at least I did my due diligence and I checked it first. A lot of times you use an outside service to do background checks, because that way you ensure kind of compliance with a whole bunch of laws that are written around what you can and can't do with background checks. More sensitive roles require maybe more stringent background checks or more often background checks. So lots of things around background checks. We often will ask about background checks and the types of background checks you do. It's always a good idea, because people are the most significant risk, and it does protect you from some liability. Employee termination, another piece around personnel security, formalized disciplinary process. It's sort of rare, believe it or not, to find these formalized disciplinary processes. It's violation 1, this happens. Violation 2, this happens. Violation 3, this happens. It's things like personnel improvement plans and these things, start with a verbal warning, then go to a written warning, and so on and so forth, usually progressive. Good idea to have in place of any company of substance. Exit interviews, rights revocation, account reviews, all those things are important. Lots of times there are gaps between deprovisioning user accounts when an employee is terminated. That's why we do regular user account reviews and things like that. Dealing with vendors, contractors, third parties, they have their own unique sets of things. Are my contractors doing background checks? Am I validating that they're doing background checks? All sorts of things there. And then outsourcing and offshoring are also personnel considerations. And we'll get deeper into that as we get further along in the course. So this is my saying, I don't know, maybe mine, I use it all the time. Information security isn't about information or security as much as it is about people. That's just the truth. And it's true for two primary, really important reasons. One, if people didn't suffer when things go wrong, nobody would care, or should they care, right? So people suffer when things go wrong. If that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have an information security thing to do, really. And number two, people are always the most significant risk. So if these two perspectives are true, if we agree with these things, then it's got to be about people, right? We can't overlook the people part of security, and don't give up on it. A lot of times people just give up. Oh, people are dumb or whatever they say. It's not true. You know, we have to work on it. Just figure out the language they're speaking, whatever we need to do to make it work. Access control, defensive categories and types. This is very, very testable. Categories, 3 categories. We've talked about it. It's in our definition of information security. Administrative, physical, and technical controls. Those are the control categories. Then there's types under those categories. The types is the intent behind the control. Intent might be to prevent something bad from happening. That'd be a preventative control. To detect something bad that happened, that'd be a detective control. So you have the categories, and then you have the intent, which would be the types. Now, where this becomes really testable is they're going to give you scenarios in the exam, one or more, where they're going to give you an example of, say, camera surveillance, right? A camera is used, whatever, blah, blah, blah. What type of control is that? Well, that's, depending on the context of which they put the question, it could be a technical control, it could be a physical control, it could be a deterrent control, or it could be potentially a detective control if there's somebody actually watching it. So, depending on the context, you'll need to be able to understand the context of which the control is being used. That will tell you the intent, and then the category. So you'll have to identify that. It's in the book, and it just takes some practice. Yeah, that's our definition. Risk analysis, all decisions should be driven by risk. Information security is risk management. That's what it is. So most people don't assess risk well, formally or informally. You see it all the time. In order for us to figure out risk, we have to take into account assets, threats, vulnerabilities. So risk, sort of in the book, is threat times vulnerability. It's not a linear mathematical equation like that where you just, unless you're doing more qualitative risk analysis, but there's more to it. Risk equals threat times vulnerability times impact. That's maybe a better definition. You'll need to know both of those definitions for the book. Risk is just overused all the time in our industry. Essentially, the likelihood of something bad happening and the impact if it did, and whatever quantification you use for it, if you apply it consistently, and it's objective, meaning it doesn't change, that's your quantitative risk analysis. There's 2 types of risk analyses, LCs. This is also very, very testable. It's great that we save it right till the end for you guys. Sorry. Risk analysis matrix. So that's just a matrix. It's used for qualitative risk analysis. It's a bunch of boxes, and you've got risk or threat here, likelihood here, and you plot things, and wherever it plots, that's your risk analysis matrix. The annualized loss expectancy, you'll need to know the math. You'll need to know the equation. It's pretty simple, but annualized loss expectancy is single loss expectancy multiplied by the annual rate of occurrence. So if a single loss is expected to cost me $10,000 and I can expect it to happen 5 times in the year, my annualized loss expectancy then would be $50,000. It's pretty simple, but knowing the acronyms, I think, is where it becomes a little more difficult. Asset value, different ways to do asset value. The market approach, what would the market pay for this asset? The income approach, how much income we create from this asset, or the cost asset, how much it costs for us to keep it for some business reason. That's asset value. You don't need to go deep into asset value. What you'll probably see in the exam is an asset costs $10,000, and blah, blah, blah. They'll give you the variables that you'll need to be able to plug into the equation. Exposure factor is usually a percentage of the asset's value that's exposed to any specific event. The single loss expectancy then would be the asset value itself, $100,000, and say 80% of my asset is exposed. That gives you a single loss expectancy then of $80,000. If you put that back up to the annual loss expectancy equation, $80,000, if I expect it to happen 3 times a year, that's $240,000 that I expect in annual loss expectancy. If the total cost of ownership of a control, annualized, is say $100,000 and it protects 50% of the asset, you can do the math and then you can figure out if it's a return on security investment or not. That's how all this works. So in the book, they do a good job, and you'll have to just practice. We can give you some practice things. We'll have a practice test on Monday, practice quiz where we can go through some of this stuff. We can also do it in the study group. This is a risk analysis matrix. So you've got the likelihood and impact there. This is all sort of subjective. What you do with a qualitative risk analysis, this is qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative uses hard metrics, hard numbers. Oftentimes we try to do dollars for a quantitative risk analysis, but we can also use just an inch, right? Define what your inch is. This is a qualitative risk analysis. In our opinion, based on my expert opinion, it plots here and here, and you just work through that. Qualitative risk analysis and quantitative risk analysis, I already gave you kind of the definitions between the two. Qualitative is using opinions, expert qualified opinions. Quantitative risk analysis is using hard numbers of some sort. Thousands of different risk assessment methodologies. We have our own risk assessment methodology. There's the FAIR risk assessment methodology. There's NIST SP 800-30. There's tons of different risk analysis. You might see it in the exam, a reference to NIST SP 800-30. NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. SP stands for Special Publication. 800 series, publication number 30 within that series. 9-step process, characterization, threat identification. You can see how you don't need to necessarily memorize the 9 steps in order and what they all are. Just know that NIST SP 800-30 is a risk assessment methodology, and you're probably fine. Types of hackers. The book says hackers, black hat, white hat, gray hat. This is how I refer to them. Black hats are crackers, malicious hackers. They're the bad guys. White hats are the good guys. White hats are the guys that we hire. There's always going to be a gap between what the black hats will do and what the white hats can do. White hats are governed by law. The black hats don't care about the law. White hats have to have some type of legal agreement in place before they can attack. Black hats don't care about that stuff. So there's always going to be a gap between what white hats can do and what black hats can do in terms of not technical skill, but what they can actually do in practice. Now, gray hats, they're just confused. I mean, I'm a black and white kind of guy, so either I'm a good guy or I'm not. Gray hats are good guys sometimes, bad guys other times. Script kiddies, they run scripts. They find applications online, find scripts. They use things. There's no ingenuity. There's no real skill for script kiddies. Outsiders versus insiders, just where the attacks are coming from. A hacktivist, their motivation is to make some type of political statement, some type of mantra, that they're trying to drive across. These are people that we need to protect against. And where this plays a role is if I'm working in a company that is doing, politically controversial things. I'll give you an instance. The last real job I had was a pharmaceutical company. We had to test our drugs on animals. I know that offends a lot of people. So places like PETA would come and try to disrupt things. That's a hacktivist, right? So if I work in those types of environments, I need to be, cognizant of those things. In other environments, it's not an issue. Bots and botnets. A bot is just a computer that's been somebody's taken control of it, usually for malicious purposes, to attack or pivot onto or attack other systems. A botnet is just a group of botnets or bots. And nowadays you can go buy a script kiddie. You can go buy a whole botnet, rent a botnet, and attack somebody with it. Phishers and spear fishers, the difference between phishers and spear fishers, phishing is usually general. It's widespread. It's not directed at a specific person. Whereas spear phishing is usually there's some intelligence behind it. I'm going after a specific characteristic of a company. We used to go after OWA a lot, Outlook Web Access, because a lot of people just used username and password for those things. So we would just replicate their OWA site and then send a spear phishing attack to that company saying, "Hey, we just upgraded our Outlook Web Access." We'd pose like we came from their IT. "I just need you to go out here and test it real quick for me," and that would have 50, 60% success rate. So spear phishing gets a better success rate than just phishing, but it also takes more work. So it's all return, just like for our business. Attackers also have a return on investment, so they'll weigh how much work and how much return they're going to get. That's just how it works nowadays. So two truths about attackers: don't assume anything. Don't assume that you understand what their motivation is. When you do an incident response or when you're working against an attacker, you go where the facts take you. Even if it's not a place you want to go, that's the facts, right? So attribution is really hard. In a lot of cases, it's not worth going and finding out who the actual attacker is. That's a very common ask in an incident response is, well, who did this? Who's responsible? Honestly, in most cases, you won't ever know. Because what you need in order to know that is evidence. And in most cases, people haven't set up their environments to have the proper evidence for you to determine that. Or you run into an end of the line scenario where the trail has ended. So don't worry about attribution in most cases. Holy buckets. Look at that. I'm 16 minutes over. Sorry. But yeah, we did it. So that was a lot of information. A lot of it was basic. I think a lot of it was just kind of revisiting things that maybe you've done before. You made it through the class today. That's awesome. Brad is leading on Monday. I get to listen to Brad. I love listening to Brad teach. He's awesome. Spend time reading. So you have 4 days off now. Spend time reading chapters 1 and 2 if you haven't already. Spend time in the study group, either helping other people who are struggling with their studies or, putting it out there for other people to help you. Please come with questions on the 20th. We will recap some of the material today, so you'll see this overlap that we'll continue to do. We'll cover questions. We'll have a quiz at the beginning next week. That's our Twitters if you want us there. Other than that, I'll see you guys on Monday. Again, I apologize for running late.